Good evening, and welcome back. Settle in, breathe softly, and let the room grow quiet. Tonight, we drift along the long river of the past, through old towns and older beliefs, where civilizations listened for meaning in the wind, where myths and prayers shared the same firelight, and where small puzzles of the world were treated like gentle messages from beyond. We won't hurry. We will move slowly, the way night moves across a sleeping street, noticing the simple things: footsteps, candlelight, distant bells. This is a calm wander through memory, through legends handed down, through signs half remembered, through the soft braid of wonder and routine. Whether you're here to rest your eyes or to float through history's quieter corners, I'm glad you're here. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Find a comfortable spot, let your shoulders fall, and allow the past to speak in a low, steady voice. Now let's begin. The night is quiet, the air is calm. A soft invitation spreads like a slow ripple across still water, welcoming the listener into a long, steady tale of the past. The story tonight drifts back to the towns and villages of medieval Europe, where people lived in close clusters of timber, stone, and earth, and where daily life was measured not only by bells and harvests, but also by signs and portents that many believed came from beyond the visible world. These signs were called omens, and they shaped how ordinary people moved through their days and nights. In those times, the world felt full of unseen forces. A crow perched on the roof of a church might be a simple bird, or it might be a messenger of death. A halo around the moon could be nothing more than thin clouds, or it could be a warning of famine or plague. People who lived through hard winters and sudden illnesses had little reason to ignore such signals. Their lives were fragile, their towns small, and their hopes often tied to what they could not explain. Slowly, traditions of interpreting strange events spread from one household to the next, until omens became woven into the rhythm of community life. The origins of these beliefs were not sudden. They stretched back centuries, into the age of Roman superstition, into the stories carried by Germanic tribes, and into the Christian teachings that filled every church with images of sin, judgment, and salvation. In each town, whispers grew into shared certainty that strange events were not random. They carried meaning, and it was the duty of those who saw them to speak, so that neighbors could prepare for whatever might come. This did not always mean disaster. Some omens promised good fortune, like the sudden blooming of flowers out of season, or the sight of a double rainbow after rain. Yet most that lingered in memory were the darker ones, the warnings that stirred unease long after the moment had passed. The first layer of belief rested on the natural world, the movements of animals, the cries of birds at unusual hours, or the sudden withering of crops became signals for what lay ahead. A dog howling in the night might mean a death would occur within days. An owl resting near the marketplace was said to foretell a fire. Rats leaving a building all at once suggested collapse or sickness within. These patterns were observed with care, repeated across generations, and slowly hardened into community knowledge. People told these signs to their children, and the children carried them forward until omens became part of how life was explained when reason could not provide answers. The second layer came from the heavens. Medieval eyes watched the skies with awe and fear. Solar eclipses were among the most powerful omens. Darkness, falling at midday, even for a short time, was understood as the displeasure of God, a warning that great sorrow was near. Comets, too, streaked across memory with weight. Chroniclers wrote of fiery tales in the sky before the Norman conquest, before the Black Death, before the death of kings. A comet they said, never appeared without reason, and its reason was rarely gentle. Even ordinary stars that shifted or flared became objects of concern. The sky was thought to be a divine canvas, upon which warnings and judgments were written for those who paid attention. In towns where faith held the community together, the church added its own voice to the meaning of omens. A cracked bell, ringing strangely, was seen as a summons to prayer before calamity. Unusual shapes in candle flames during Mass were whispered about afterward, connecting the spiritual world to daily fears. Priests sometimes tried to calm the people, explaining that such events were tests of faith rather than signs of doom. Yet the hold of fear was strong. The parishioners, after all, had seen enough sickness, famine, and sudden war to doubt the comfort of ordinary explanations. What terrified people most was not only the omen itself, but the uncertainty it carried. An omen did not give exact dates or details. It gave shadows of possibility, leaving minds to fill in the rest. A strange knocking at night might be the wind, or it might be the restless spirit of the unburied. The sound lingered in thought, and people carried their unease into the market the next morning, into their work, into their sleep. The omen traveled through the town not as a fact, but as a question that no one could answer with certainty. Thus, medieval towns became places where daily life was steady on the surface, yet always subject to invisible tension beneath. People plowed their fields, traded their goods, and gathered at the tavern, but they also carried the memory of omens that had unsettled them. A dream of teeth falling out, a rooster crowing at midnight, a shadow moving in the corner of an empty room. These experiences, small in themselves, grew larger when shared, until the whole town leaned toward the same unease, braced for a misfortune they could not name. The quiet acceptance of these beliefs reveals much about the fragility of those times. Medicine was limited. Weather was unpredictable. Wars arrived without warning. In such a world, omens gave shape to fear. They offered a framework to hold the unknown, even if it brought no comfort. To say that a strange event was a sign of coming trouble was, in a way, to prepare the mind for what might otherwise feel unbearable. And so, omens did not disappear. They continued to ripple through generations, forming a quiet undercurrent of medieval life. As night settled in those towns, candles flickering and fires burning low, the memory of omens accompanied people to their rest. Some whispered prayers against them. Some simply accepted them as part of life's rhythm. The sense of watchfulness never truly ended, for in the silence of the dark, another sound, another shadow, might begin the cycle again. And so, the story of strange omens carried on, one town to the next, one generation to the next, always shaping how people saw their place in a world filled with mystery and uncertainty. The tale continues, moving from general fears to the specific events that marked medieval memory. For many towns, omens were not just stories whispered at night. They were recorded in chronicles, carved into memory, and remembered alongside the great events of famine, plague, and war. The chronicles of medieval Europe often took care to note the presence of omens before great events. Monks and scribes, sitting with steady hands by candlelight, wrote down the signs that people reported, believing them to be threads in the tapestry of divine design. These records show how deeply such beliefs were woven into daily life, for they appear again and again, attached to times of unrest, disease, or sudden death. When plague swept across towns, people remembered what they had seen in the days before: dogs that howled without stopping, clouds that gathered in strange shapes above the fields, a single raven circling the town square. These sights seemed small at the time, yet when sickness came, they became proof that the world had given warning. Such memories were repeated from house to house, linking the terror of illness to the strange details of nature. For those who survived, the connection was never forgotten, and the same signs were feared again whenever the air grew heavy with rumor of disease. Before battles, too, omens were remembered with care. Soldiers and townsfolk alike noted how the sky changed, how the animals behaved, how the silence of the night seemed charged with weight. Chroniclers tell of birds that fell dead from the sky before armies clashed, and of red lights seen on the horizon where no fire burned. Victories and defeats were explained not only by the strength of armies, but by the signs that appeared beforehand, as though the outcome had already been written in the natural world. Even kings, though surrounded by advisors, could not ignore the unease such reports created. A ruler who dismissed an omen risked appearing blind to divine order. The turning of the seasons also brought signs that townspeople watched carefully. Spring that came too early, with blossoms breaking under frost, was thought to warn of lean harvests ahead. Hailstorms in summer carried messages of famine, while thunder during winter was said to foretell unrest. Each unusual event in the cycle of weather became more than weather. It became a note in a larger pattern, one that shaped how people prepared themselves for the months to come. The storing of grain, the planning of feasts, even the prayers said during Mass were influenced by the memory of omens. Not all omens were seen with the eye. Some were heard, felt, or dreamed. Dreams held particular power, for sleep was thought to open the soul to the unseen world. A dream of fire might foretell actual fire. A dream of a broken wheel could point to an accident on the road. Women and men alike shared their dreams with family, and such dreams were retold until they carried the weight of certainty. A dream that matched an event, even by chance, strengthened the entire belief that the dream world was bound to waking life. Towns became places where the line between night and day, between dream and waking, was thin and porous. Strange births, too, were carried into the record of omens. A calf born with 2 heads, a child born with unusual marks. These events unsettled communities and were taken as signs that God or fate was speaking through the body itself. Such births were often remembered for generations, not because of the child or animal, but because of what followed soon after: a storm, a fire, or a death that seemed to confirm the warning. In these ways, the natural and the supernatural were never fully separate. Each occurrence in life had the potential to be more than itself, to carry meaning beyond what the senses could plainly see. As time passed, omens gathered into a long chain of memory. Each town, each family, added its own stories to the greater pattern. A particular village might recall the night a strange light hovered above the churchyard, followed soon after by an outbreak of illness. Another might speak of the time the river froze solid before winter had even begun, and how famine followed. These stories were repeated with steady voices, not to frighten, but to remind. The lesson was simple. The world spoke in signs, and people were wise to pay attention. Even as these beliefs continued, the rhythm of life remained slow, steady, and grounded in routine. Markets opened, bells rang, fields were tended, and children played. Omens did not stop life. They gave it a quiet undercurrent of meaning. They filled the silence between daily tasks with reflection. They offered explanations for what could not otherwise be explained. For medieval towns, the presence of omens was not an interruption, but a constant thread, one that wove through every season, every year, every generation. And so the story of Omens continued to deepen, tied to plague, famine, battle, and dream. Yet beyond the individual events lay a greater pattern still. How these beliefs shaped the minds of the people, and how they guided choices, fears, and hopes across centuries. This is where the tale moves next, into the cultural weight of omens, and how they became part of the shared identity of medieval towns. The culture of medieval Europe was bound together not only by faith and law, but also by the quiet weight of signs that people believed shaped their fate. Omens were not isolated details spoken once and forgotten. They became part of the shared rhythm of community life. They were spoken in whispers at the hearth, discussed in the marketplace, and woven into sermons delivered from the pulpit. Over time, these strange warnings and portents became more than moments of fear. They became a language through which towns understood themselves and their place in the larger world. People lived close to the earth, close to the seasons, and close to one another. In such closeness, events rarely went unnoticed. If a rooster crowed at midnight, the whole neighborhood soon heard about it. If smoke rose in peculiar shapes from a chimney, it became the subject of speculation before the day was done. A dream told at breakfast might be repeated to half the town by evening. This constant exchange of detail meant that omens did not belong to individuals. They belonged to the whole community, linking everyone in a shared sense of expectation. The very act of telling and retelling deepened their power. The church played an important role in shaping how omens were understood. Priests, steeped in scripture, reminded parishioners that signs and wonders had long been part of divine history. The Bible itself was filled with plagues, dreams, visions, and stars that carried meaning. Parishioners drew strength from these stories, recognizing their own experiences reflected in ancient texts. Yet the church also warned against superstition, urging people to place their trust in prayer and repentance rather than in fear of birds or dreams. This tension between guidance and warning gave omens a complicated place in medieval thought. They were acknowledged, sometimes even respected, but never fully dismissed. In towns large and small, guilds and councils also responded to omens in practical ways. If a fire was foretold by strange signs, more water buckets were prepared. If famine was whispered after an unusual storm, grain was stored with greater care. Though decisions were made with sober reasoning, the presence of omens pushed leaders to act cautiously, as if preparing against invisible forces. In this way, omens shaped not only thoughts, but also actions, influencing how food was kept, how defenses were built, and how journeys were planned. The cultural weight of omens also extended into festivals and rituals. During the changing of the seasons, especially at midsummer and midwinter, people performed small acts to guard against misfortune. Herbs were burned, charms were hung over doorways, and prayers were spoken to ward off ill omens. These practices gave a sense of control in a world that often felt unpredictable. The repetition of ritual made fear bearable. When strange signs appeared, people could remind themselves that they had already taken steps to protect their homes and families. Such reassurance, however small, was enough to carry them through long winters and uncertain harvests. Artists and storytellers preserved omens in their own ways. Illuminated manuscripts depicted comets blazing across the sky, while carvings on church doors showed strange beasts and unnatural creatures. Folk songs carried the memory of unusual events, tying them to melodies that could be passed down for generations. In these forms, omens were not only warnings, but also culture, expressions of shared belief that bound people together. To know the omens of one's town was to be part of its memory and its identity. The presence of omens also gave rise to figures who claimed special insight. Wise women, healers, and local seers often interpreted strange events for others. They read patterns in smoke, in dreams, or in the flight of birds. While some dismissed them, many sought their advice, for even a calm word could ease the burden of fear. These figures occupied a delicate place in society, respected in private yet sometimes distrusted in public. Still, their role in shaping how communities understood omens cannot be overlooked. They gave voice to uncertainty, turning the unknown into counsel. In this way, omens became more than superstition. They became part of the social glue that held medieval towns together. They were shared knowledge, shared fear, and shared memory. They influenced the stories people told, the choices they made, and the rituals they kept. Even when omens proved false, their cultural power endured, for they reminded people of the unseen threads that seemed to run through their lives. To live in a medieval town was to live in a place where every shadow, sound, or dream could hold meaning, and where meaning was always shared. The story moves forward now, toward the times when omens were not only remembered, but feared with particular intensity. The years of plague, famine, and war, when strange signs seemed to gather like heavy clouds over Europe. It is there, in the weight of disaster, that omens carried their deepest power. When plague and famine swept across medieval towns, omens were remembered with a sharpness that lingered for generations. People who had once treated signs with quiet unease now spoke of them with trembling certainty, convinced that the world had spoken before disaster struck. In the years when the Black Death spread, stories multiplied of lights in the sky, of animals behaving strangely, and of foul odors rising without cause. Chroniclers recorded comets blazing across Europe, fire-colored clouds at dusk, and flocks of birds falling silent all at once. Each detail became tied in memory to the approach of sickness, giving omens their heaviest weight. During plague years, ordinary life collapsed, streets emptied, churches filled with prayers, and families kept to themselves. Yet even in silence, the memory of omens traveled. People whispered of dogs howling at unseen figures. They recalled the night winds that carried strange sounds before illness arrived. In one village, a cow gave birth to a deformed calf, and soon after, the disease took half the population. In another, townsfolk swore that a ghostly procession of monks had been seen walking the road by torchlight, vanishing into the dark, only days before the first victims fell ill. Such stories gave shape to fear, making suffering feel less random, less without warning. Famine brought its own omens. Failed harvests were often linked to strange weather, and unusual weather was rarely seen as chance. A frost in midsummer, a swarm of locusts, or a thunderstorm in the depth of winter were all read as signs of God's displeasure. People recalled unusual animal behavior, rats fleeing barns, birds flying low across fields, and told one another these had been warnings. By the time the granaries stood empty and hunger spread, the omens seemed confirmed, their truth written into the hollow stomachs of the people. In this way, disaster and omen became bound so tightly that one was rarely remembered without the other. Wars, too, were framed by omens. Before armies clashed, people looked to the sky, to the animals, and to the earth for signs of what lay ahead. Chroniclers wrote of red moons before battles, of rivers running strangely high or low, of armor clanging in the night with no soldier near. In towns close to the front, fear sharpened every detail. A raven perched on the gatehouse was said to foretell defeat. A sudden silence in the marketplace was whispered to mean the enemy was already marching. These beliefs made each campaign not only a struggle of men, but also a drama of fate, shaped by the signs of the unseen. In every disaster, omens played a double role. They were warnings, but they were also explanations. When suffering came, it was easier to endure if people could say the world had signaled it first. This did not remove the pain, but it gave it shape, a reason, a place in the pattern of divine order. And when disaster passed, the omens were remembered longer than the details of hunger or sickness. They became markers in memory, easier to repeat than numbers of dead or months of hardship. People might forget the exact toll of famine, but they remembered the crow that perched on the church roof the night before it began. The cycle repeated itself across centuries. Disaster gave omens weight, and omens gave disaster meaning. Each generation carried forward both the fear of calamity and the memory of signs that had seemed to announce it. In this way, omens remained steady companions of suffering, always ready to be seen anew when the world turned dark. As the story continues, it turns to the quieter side of belief, not the years of terror, but the daily ways in which omens touched ordinary life. For even when towns were not shaken by plague, famine, or war, the rhythm of omens moved softly through fields, homes, and dreams. In the calmer years, when towns were spared the weight of plague or war, omens still drifted quietly through daily life. They did not always carry terror. Often they were small signals, noted with care and spoken of in steady voices, reminders that the world was never entirely without mystery. People did not wait for disaster to read meaning into the unusual. Even in times of peace, they turned to omens as a way of understanding life's constant uncertainty. A family might wake to find a bird had flown into their home, beating its wings against the window. This was rarely dismissed as chance. It was thought to signify change, perhaps a marriage, perhaps a journey, or perhaps an unexpected visitor. If the bird escaped unharmed, the omen was softened. If it died within the house, the meaning grew darker, for death within walls was an uneasy symbol. Such moments became part of conversation over meals, and in the marketplace, simple events given depth by the quiet belief that all things spoke if one paid attention. Dreams continued to hold a strong place in this rhythm. People recorded dreams of rivers rising, of bridges breaking, of fields turning to ash, and treated them as warnings. At the same time, dreams of gold coins, blooming flowers, or laughter in green meadows were thought to carry good fortune. While fear filled many tales of omens, hope lived there too, though often more quietly. A favorable omen might give comfort before a journey or reassurance before a marriage. It softened the unknown, offering the sense that unseen forces smiled as well as frowned. Everyday work also became tied to small signs. Farmers looked for the way the wind shifted at sunrise to decide whether to sow seed. Fishermen watched the behavior of seabirds before launching their boats. Bakers paid attention to cracks in their loaves, reading in them small hints of luck or warning. These were not grand events. They were daily rituals of observation, woven into the fabric of ordinary labor. They gave people a sense of connection between their work and the wider forces of the world. In homes, small protective acts were performed to guard against bad omens. A sprig of herbs hung above a doorway, a piece of iron placed near the bed, a prayer murmured when a candle flickered too strongly. These acts were quiet, repeated without drama, yet they carried weight. They gave reassurance, even when no disaster followed. The presence of such customs reveals how omens shaped not only memory, but also habit, teaching people to guard themselves against unseen currents in ways that became second nature. children learned these beliefs early. They were told not to step over cracks in certain stones, not to whistle at night, not to disturb nests of particular birds. These lessons, simple in form, instilled respect for signs from the world around them. They turned superstition into education, passing knowledge down through generations. In this way, omens became part of how children were taught to see their surroundings, not as silent and empty, but as filled with meaning, waiting to be read. Even leisure was touched by omens. At festivals, people exchanged stories of unusual sights from the past year. They recalled the wandering lights seen in fields, the sudden silence of animals, the odd shape of clouds at sunset. These stories did not always stir fear. They became part of entertainment, gentle reminders that the world was full of small mysteries. Laughter often mixed with unease as people retold them, for even when the meaning was uncertain, the telling itself kept the bond of belief alive. The presence of omens in ordinary life shows how deeply they were woven into thought. They did not require great disasters to remain alive. They touched meals, work, travel, and play. They shaped how people looked at the sky, how they listened to the night, and how they explained what they could not control. In calm years, they did not fade. They simply shifted from warning to guidance, from terror to reassurance, remaining steady companions of medieval existence. The story now moves further inward, toward the deeper fears behind these beliefs. For beneath the daily habits and gentle customs lay something larger, the sense that unseen forces constantly surrounded human life, forces that could never be fully known or avoided. It was this unseen presence that gave omens their lasting power. Beneath the ordinary habits of watching birds, reading dreams, and noting the changes of weather, there lay a deeper current of belief, the sense that unseen forces moved constantly around human life. Medieval townspeople lived with the quiet conviction that their world was never fully within their control. Illness, war, fire, and famine could arrive without warning. Yet omens suggested that warning was always possible if one was observant enough. This gave every detail of daily life an added layer of meaning, one that shaped thought and behavior in ways that lingered for centuries. People imagined the world as a place filled with spirits, angels, and demons, moving invisibly alongside the living. Omens were seen as messages from these beings, small signs of their presence made visible for a moment. A shadow, where no person stood, might be a restless soul. A sudden gust of wind in a silent room might be a spirit's passing. These beliefs were not treated with excitement, but with steady acceptance, for such forces were thought to be part of life's natural order. Omens were simply the signs by which people glimpsed the hidden layers of that order. The church gave structure to these fears. Priests taught that the devil could send deceptions into the world using false signs to mislead the faithful. At the same time, they reminded parishioners that angels, too, might send warnings of danger. This left ordinary people in a place of constant interpretation, never entirely certain whether a sign was holy or unholy. The safest response was prayer, fasting, or confession, to align oneself with God no matter the source. Thus, omens deepened religious life, drawing people back to church whenever they felt the touch of uncertainty. Legends added weight to these unseen forces. Tales told of phantom armies marching across the sky, their ghostly armor clashing in the night before battles began. Travelers spoke of lights flickering in forests, leading the curious astray until they were lost. Old songs carried the memory of headless figures, wandering roads as warnings of death. These stories gave shape to the invisible, making fear easier to speak of. Though told with quiet voices, they sank into memory, reinforcing the belief that omens were not merely chance, but glimpses of a world just beyond human sight. The presence of omens also reflected the medieval struggle to understand suffering. When crops failed or illness struck, it was not enough to say that chance had caused it. People sought reasons. An omen provided one, linking events to divine will or to human sin. If a town had seen an owl land on the church roof before famine, it could be explained as a warning ignored. If a comet had blazed before war, it could be read as God's judgment for pride or cruelty. These connections gave order to the chaos of hardship, making life's blows easier to endure, even if no comfort came from the explanation. Fear of unseen forces led to protective customs. Charms were worn, holy water sprinkled, prayers whispered before travel. These were not acts of drama, but small gestures repeated often, each meant to shield against whatever the next omen might bring. People carried herbs in pouches, traced the sign of the cross when hearing unusual noises, or avoided certain paths after nightfall. These behaviors, passed from parent to child, became as natural as eating or sleeping. They turned belief into habit, embedding fear and hope alike into the smallest motions of daily life. What is most striking is the calm endurance with which these beliefs were held. People did not constantly tremble under fear of omens. Rather, they accepted them as part of the world's fabric, as ordinary as the changing seasons. The unseen was always there, sometimes silent, sometimes speaking, and people lived within its presence without expecting escape. Omens did not end life's routines. They shaped them, giving them a deeper layer of meaning, turning each unusual sound or sight into a quiet reminder of life's fragility and mystery. And so, through the steady flow of generations, the idea of omens carried both fear and structure. They explained, they warned, they shaped, and they endured. As the tale continues, it moves now toward the way these beliefs slowly began to shift. For as learning grew, and as reason and science quietly spread across Europe, the old weight of omens began to weaken. Yet for centuries before, they had already carved their mark into memory. As the centuries passed, the framework of belief that surrounded omens began to change, though the shift was slow and often uneven. In some towns, the same signs that once caused deep fear continued to be taken with solemn seriousness. In others, people started to question whether the cries of birds or the shapes of clouds truly held messages for human lives. This gradual transformation reflected the broader currents moving through Europe. As learning spread, new explanations were offered, and the steady rise of written knowledge began to compete with inherited memory. The growth of monasteries and universities brought with it a different way of thinking. Monks, who had long recorded omens in their chronicles, also studied the heavens with care. They charted the movement of the stars, the cycles of the moon, and the paths of comets. Some began to describe these events less as warnings from heaven, and more as natural phenomena with regular patterns. While the majority of people still saw omens in the sky, these scholarly voices introduced the idea that the heavens might be ordered not only by divine will, but also by laws of nature waiting to be understood. In time, this quiet reasoning would grow stronger. The church, too, shifted its stance. While sermons continued to speak of signs and wonders, priests increasingly warned against attaching too much weight to superstition. The more unusual customs, placing charms on doors, reading omens in the flight of birds, were sometimes condemned as remnants of pagan belief. People were urged to rely more fully on prayer and sacrament, and less on whispers of signs. Yet the old traditions were deeply rooted, and many continued them in private, balancing official teaching with personal habit. This tension between doctrine and daily life shaped how omens were remembered during these years. Trade and travel also played their part in softening the hold of omens. Merchants who journeyed between towns carried with them new stories, new explanations, and new ways of seeing the world. A comet that one town viewed as a dire omen might be described by a traveler as a common sight, witnessed in other lands without disaster. Such exchanges did not erase fear, but they widened perspective, reminding people that what seemed extraordinary in one place could be ordinary in another. Slowly, the certainty that every strange event carried divine weight began to loosen. Despite these shifts, omens did not disappear. They adjusted, becoming quieter, less absolute, but still present. People continued to tell stories of unusual events, though now the tone was often more reflective than fearful. Dreams were still shared, though sometimes with laughter rather than dread. Even the chroniclers, while noting comets and eclipses, began to add explanations from astronomy alongside the older interpretations. The world was not yet ready to abandon its sense of signs, but it was beginning to carry them differently, with more distance and less weight. The persistence of omens in this changing world reveals their deep role in culture. They were not only tools of fear, but also habits of thought, ways of making sense of uncertainty. Even as explanations grew more rational, people still found comfort in looking for meaning beyond the visible. A farmer might accept that weather shaped his crops, yet still note the way the wind moved at sunrise. A mother might pray in church, yet still keep herbs above her child's bed. Old and new ways coexisted, neither fully defeating the other. This period of transition shows the resilience of tradition. Omens were too deeply tied to memory, too woven into the stories of disaster and survival, to vanish quickly. Instead, they lingered, reshaped by the slow rise of reason, but not erased by it. They continued to flow through generations, sometimes feared, sometimes questioned, but always remembered. And so the tale moves toward its later chapters, where the gradual decline of omens becomes clearer, and where they pass from being living beliefs into echoes of the past. Stories carried forward more for curiosity than for fear, preserved as folklore rather than as warnings. As the late medieval centuries unfolded, the quiet decline of omens became more visible. Towns still told stories of strange signs, but the intensity with which they were feared slowly began to lessen. The reasons for this change were many. Knowledge expanded, literacy spread. The rhythms of trade and the stirrings of science created explanations that competed with older ways of thinking. What had once been seen as direct messages from unseen forces was gradually reframed as the natural order of the world. Astrology played an interesting role in this transition. For centuries, the stars had been read as signs of fate, with comets and eclipses carrying dread. But by the later Middle Ages, astrology became more systematized, offering charts and predictions based on calculation rather than rumor. Learned men in universities studied the heavens with instruments, writing careful observations that treated celestial movements as patterns that could be measured. While this did not remove the sense of mystery, it shifted the conversation. Signs in the sky were still read for meaning, but now, through books and diagrams, less through whispers at the marketplace. Omens became more formal, more contained within study, and less overwhelming to daily life. The rise of chroniclers and record keepers also reshaped memory. As events were written down with greater detail, not every famine or war was tied to an omen. A harvest failure might be explained by storms, a sickness by poor air or bad water. These records provided alternative reasons, slowly loosening the grip of superstition. Yet the habit of linking signs and disasters did not vanish. A comet might be noted both as an astronomical event and as a portent of plague. The two explanations lived side by side, neither fully pushing out the other. Economic and social growth in towns further weakened the hold of omens. As markets grew busier and life became more complex, people had less time to linger over every unusual sound or shadow. The noise of trade, the bustle of guilds, the growing size of cities, all these diluted the impact of individual omens. In a small village, a crow perched on the roof was news for everyone. In a large city, it was simply another bird. The scale of life began to diminish the weight of small signs, though they still clung to memory in quieter corners. The church, too, continued its effort to separate faith from superstition. Priests and bishops spoke against charms, against the reading of omens in animals, against dreams taken too seriously. Instead, they encouraged confession, penance, and prayer. Many followed this guidance, especially in towns where reform movements took root. Yet in the countryside, far from the centers of change, old customs survived. Villagers still read the weather in unusual ways, still told stories of restless spirits, still passed down the signs that had comforted or frightened their parents. The decline of omens was not uniform. It moved slowly, differently in each place. By the dawn of the Renaissance, omens had taken on a quieter role. They remained in memory, in folk practice, in the rhythms of rural life, but they no longer dominated thought in the way they once had. They were preserved in chronicles, in songs, and in the stories of elders. People spoke of them with interest, sometimes with caution, sometimes with curiosity. They were beginning to shift from belief into folklore, from living fear into cultural memory. This transition did not mean that omens disappeared. They continued to be told, for people still needed ways to explain the unknown. But they carried less weight, less certainty. They became stories to be recalled rather than commands to be followed. They survived as part of identity, linking people to their ancestors, reminding them of how their towns once faced the mysteries of the world. And so, as the tale moves forward, it enters the stage of reflection, where omens are remembered less for their power and more for the insight they give into human life. For in their long history, they reveal not only fear, but also resilience, not only superstition, but also the steady effort to make sense of a fragile world. By the later centuries, when Europe edged toward the Renaissance and the slow dawn of new thought, omens remained present but carried a different character. They were no longer taken by all as binding warnings, yet they lingered as echoes of an older world. People remembered them, repeated them, and sometimes smiled at them. But they also knew other ways of explanation. The balance had shifted. What was once a primary guide through fear was becoming part of cultural memory. In towns where printing presses began to spread books and pamphlets, the written word offered explanations that competed with tradition. Weather was described in terms of winds and seasons, not only in terms of divine displeasure. Diseases were studied with growing care, slowly linked to causes more earthly than heavenly. Yet even as new knowledge circulated, the old omens held a certain comfort, a dream of death, a strange cry at night, or the appearance of a comet still stirred whispers. People lived in a world where the past and the future overlapped, where reason and superstition walked side by side. The role of omens gradually shifted into storytelling. Elders told children about the signs their own parents had seen before famine or plague. These tales were spoken not to terrify, but to keep alive the memory of hardship and endurance. A child listening to such a story learned less about the omen itself and more about the resilience of the community that had survived what followed. In this way, omens became a bridge to history, carrying lessons wrapped in cautionary tales. They softened into folklore, passing from belief into tradition. Art and literature also preserved them. Plays and poems mentioned strange portents before tragic events, weaving old beliefs into new creative forms. Painters placed comets and eclipses in their scenes of history, keeping alive the association between celestial signs and earthly fate. These works did not instruct people to fear omens as their ancestors had, but they kept the memory alive, embedding it into culture. The echo of the past remained visible, even as daily life leaned more toward explanation and order. In the countryside, where change moved more slowly, omens retained stronger presence. Farmers still marked the sky, still read animal behavior, still passed down small customs against ill fortune. A rustle in the night might still be treated with caution. A dream might still be spoken of with seriousness. Yet even here, the tone was gentler, more balanced. People did not always expect disaster. They simply acknowledged the possibility, accepting omens as one part of life among many. The fear had quieted, replaced with a steadier rhythm of recognition. The persistence of omens across centuries reveals their deep human function. They gave shape to uncertainty, offered meaning in hardship, and connected communities through shared belief. When reason grew stronger and explanations clearer, that function became less necessary, yet the stories remained. They lived on because they touched not only fear, but imagination. They turned small events into narratives, connecting people to the mysteries of their world in ways that science alone did not replace. Thus, by the close of the Middle Ages, omens stood at a threshold. They were no longer the guiding weight they had once been, yet they were not forgotten. They had become part of memory, part of culture, part of the long inheritance passed down through words and habits. Their power was gentler, but their presence endured. And in that endurance, they revealed the long thread of human desire to find meaning in the unknown. As the story moves toward its later flow, it will reflect on legacy, how these beliefs, though softened, did not vanish, but transformed into the folklore and superstitions that still linger quietly in modern times. In the centuries that followed, the legacy of omens remained, though their form shifted once more. The modern age brought greater reliance on reason, science, and observation, yet the old stories were never fully lost. They were carried into folklore, into customs, into the small habits of daily life that survived even when their original meaning faded. What had once been feared as warnings from unseen forces became softened into traditions, sayings, and quiet superstitions. People continued to speak of certain birds as messengers of change. A raven perched on a roof was still treated with unease. A swallow flying into a house was still thought to mark a turning point. These beliefs no longer shaped decisions with the force they once had, yet they lived on in speech, in caution, in memory. Dreams, too, retained their quiet weight. Families passed down interpretations, linking certain images to fortune or misfortune, repeating them not as commands, but as curiosities, part of the fabric of household lore. The movement of the heavens remained a source of fascination. Eclipses, once feared as the shadow of divine anger, became objects of wonder, studied through glass and written about in books. Yet even as explanation grew, the memory of their earlier fear lingered. People still gathered to watch them in silence, still felt the strange weight of the sky darkening in daylight. Comets, charted and measured, were still described in stories as heralds of change, their fiery tails carrying echoes of medieval dread. The balance between knowledge and memory created a layered way of seeing, where old meanings and new understandings coexisted. In rural communities, protective customs survived with little alteration. Herbs were still hung above doors, iron was still placed near beds, prayers were still whispered when candles flickered strangely. These acts no longer held the same communal force they once had, yet they carried comfort, a quiet inheritance from ancestors who had lived with far less certainty. Each small gesture was a link to the past, a way of acknowledging that life had always been fragile and that people had always sought to shield themselves against what they could not control. Writers and collectors of folklore in later centuries gave new life to these traditions. They traveled through villages, recording the omens that people still remembered, preserving them in books that would be read long after belief had softened. In their collections, the everyday fears of medieval life became curiosities, echoes of a vanished world. Yet for those who lived in the towns where these stories were told, the omens were not curiosities. They were part of identity, part of belonging, part of the steady continuity between generations. Even in modern times, traces remain. People still knock on wood to ward off misfortune. They still cross their fingers for luck. They still pause when a black cat crosses their path. These are fragments of the same tradition, softened into habit, stripped of their heavier fear, but carrying the same thread of meaning, that small signs in the world reflect larger patterns in life. The omens of medieval towns did not vanish. They transformed, flowing forward into customs that remain with quiet persistence. The story of strange omens, then, is not only a tale of fear, but also of endurance. It shows how human beings, faced with uncertainty, shape meaning from the details of the world around them. It shows how generations carry memory, turning fear into folklore, and folklore into habit. What once terrified entire towns now lingers as simple sayings, gestures, and traditions. Yet the thread remains unbroken. The omens of the past still walk quietly beside the present, softened but never forgotten. And so the tale closes with stillness, as all bedtime stories must. The fires of medieval hearths have long since gone cold. The whispers of omens in market squares have long since faded into silence. Yet the memory endures, steady and calm, reminding us that people have always sought patterns in the unknown, always listened for meaning in the quiet of the world. It is in that listening, slow and steady, that one can drift toward rest, carried gently by the echoes of a past both distant and familiar. Then let the story settle now, as night settles over the quiet towns it is described. The cobbled streets are empty. The market stalls are closed. The small wooden doors of houses are barred against the chill. Yet inside, the glow of firelight still lingers, just as it did centuries ago, when people sat together and spoke in hushed voices of signs and portents. Those voices have long since faded, yet their memories remain, drifting gently like smoke that never truly disappears. The omens of old were heavy with fear, yet they were also full of meaning. They gave shape to mystery, offered patterns where none could be found, and allowed people to feel less alone in the face of uncertainty. They tied generations together, linking grandmothers to grandchildren, priests to parishioners, scribes to kings. Each whisper of a crow's cry, each dream retold by candlelight, became part of a long chain of memory. That chain has stretched across time, softening as centuries passed, until now it rests not as terror, but as quiet folklore, a background hum in the rhythm of human life. And so, the strange omens that once terrified medieval towns have become no more than echoes, faint but steady, lingering in gestures and sayings that remain with us today. A knock upon wood, a glance at the sky before a journey, a prayer whispered without thinking. They remind us that the search for meaning never ends, that people have always looked for signs in the world around them, and that even in the plainest details, they found something to carry them through. As the tale closes, imagine the old towns resting in stillness. The church bells are silent, the streets are dark, the fields beyond are wrapped in mist. All is calm. The omens, once feared, are now only shadows in memory, softened into gentle stories that drift like the turning of seasons. They no longer trouble the mind. They only soothe it, reminding the listener of how time flows steadily onward, carrying all things into quiet. Let the weight of those long centuries fall away now. Let the patterns fade into stillness. The story has been told from beginning to end, from fear to memory, from omen to echo. There is nothing left to wait for, nothing left to fear. Only calm, only rest. The night is steady, the past is distant, and the world is quiet once more.